They're closing brains down by imposing views upon them. And even the teaching style that you see, it's shocking. And I've heard this again from loads of parents and some young people. They're being told what to think. They're being told what is correct. They're not even being told what to think. They're being told not to think, just to repeat mantras.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest is journalist and legendary feminist activist Julie Bindel. Julie has been outspoken for decades about violence against women, and she has in recent years been a particularly sharp and intelligent voice in the conversation around the new gender movement and medicalized transition in young people. She has a new podcast about it, Julie in Genderland, a 10-part series that focuses on the stories of well-meaning parents and the obstacles and confusion they face while advocating for their kids. We talk about that podcast at length in this conversation. We also talk about a separate but not entirely unrelated issue, which is the story of the so-called grooming gangs in the UK that emerged over the last several decades. These were cases where extremely vulnerable young girls and women, mostly in the north of England, were sex trafficked in shockingly large numbers. Julie was the first to report on that story back in the early 2000s, and we talk here about some of the parallels to what we're seeing in some of the gender stories. I will tell you that Julie will be a guest speaker in the Unspeakeasy, my community for free-thinking women, on November 19th. She'll be zooming in as an unspeaker to have a private hangout just for us. So if you enjoy what you hear and want to continue the conversation, go to theunspeakeasy.com and see what we're all about. In the meantime, here's my interview with Julie Bindel. Julie Bindel, welcome to The Unspeakable.
It's great to be here, Meghan. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, it is a huge privilege to have you here. I feel like it is long overdue. There's so much to talk about. But primarily, we're going to talk about your new podcast series, Julie in Genderland. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
Extraordinarily well done. I know you teamed up with Samantha Smith, who's a former BBC journalist and producer, and the professionalism is quite evident and appreciated, especially because I feel like with this issue, there's so many people just like trying to cover it on our own because it's so institutionally unsupported. So it was really nice to see such polish and sure-footedness. So I guess I wanted to start here. You've been talking and writing about this issue for many years now, and you are primarily a writer. Why did you decide that the podcast was the best format?
I couldn't have possibly fitted all of the stories that we needed to tell into even a long form article, even a long read. And I personally think that there should only be as many words as is absolutely necessary. And so it wouldn't have been, I think, if I had actually put it together in a 10,000 word essay, every word would have counted because the voices of the parents and of the detransitioned young woman, lesbian that we interviewed, would have counted and would have resonated. But I think if people don't hear the voice sometimes, if they don't hear the intonation, if they don't hear the distress, if they don't hear the kind of despair and the hope, then it's difficult sometimes to get those nuances across in print. And also, I mean, I'm not wedded to print journalism. That is how I started. But I've always loved talking and I've always loved debating and broadcasting. And so I do a lot of that. And I find that often is just a much better way to get people to understand what you're saying, whether or not they agree. And these parents, you know, you've heard the series, they're all, I hate to use this word, but I'm going to anyway. They're all perfectly ordinary people from different walks of life, right? None of them are extremist in any of their views. Had there been, they would still have a right to be concerned about what was happening to their children. But every single one of these people would have felt fine if their son or daughter had come home and said that they were lesbian or gay, right? That wouldn't have been an issue. So we're talking about those kinds of soft, liberal, decent, ordinary people. And if we can't relate to those stories, to those voices, then we know for sure that there is a willful ignorance and a concerted effort to drown out voices that are telling the truth on this.
Yeah. The series is really animated by a deep empathy for parents. You're not a parent yourself. And, there are so many ways one could get into this subject. You could focus on the kids themselves. You could focus on the clinicians. You could focus on the institutions. What made you decide to go into it from the angle of the parents and their experiences?
Probably 3 or 4 particular reasons. One is that the voices of detransitioned women and men have, I think, been exploited to some degree. And I think that there's such deep levels of trauma, and I don't use that word lightly because it's so overused, but I mean such deep levels of trauma with the survivors of gender woo and gender medicine, that I think that we are in danger of using them. And I don't mean that we are bad people for wanting to get their voices out. In fact, we wouldn't be where we are now had it not been for those really good in-depth pieces about those that regret going through going down the gender line. But most people don't admit to regretting it. And I think many, many do regret it because they are then excommunicated from the only community, which is like a cult, that they have invested so much in. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the parents kept coming to me. They kept emailing me. They kept stopping me at conferences. They kept writing to me and saying, we're trying to do something to protect not just our children, but other children from ruined lives and the effects of drugs and surgery and the like. And we're just called bigots and transphobes and Nazis. You've heard all of this before, so none of this will surprise you probably, or any of your subscribers, your listeners. And so I thought, well, there's a real story to tell here, because the assumption is either the parents are extreme Munchausen by proxy, love the idea of having a trans child. That's a big celebrity thing, isn't it? Gay and lesbian is so last season now. So there's those, and then there's the others who just hate everything that isn't conforming to sex stereotypes, and they're bigots and they would hate their kids if they were gay. So that was, and then the third reason, I think, was that if we take away the responsibility of safeguarding from teachers, social workers, and good non-abusive parents, kids have no boundaries and they'll have no protection and no guidance. And I know some parents are bad. I know some parents are terrible. I know some parents are abusive, but they're a minority, right? And we know this because I've been doing the work that I do on violence against women and girls for decades and decades. And we know that there are some terrible parents, but we know the majority of them just want to look out for their kids. But I also wanted to test myself because I never wanted kids. I get more, I've had more vitriol. I mean, not the volume of vitriol I've had because of the gender thing, but I've had, so some of the worst abuse I've had, apart from the vegans, when I once wrote about vegan culture, is from mothers who think that because you say you are happily child-free and consider it to be it would be my worst nightmare to raise children. And actually to be around them, to be honest, for more than a few hours.
We have to have a whole other conversation about this. I would say it would be my children's worst nightmare to have me as their parent. So right. You're welcome, child.
But I just wanted to test myself because, of course, you get all kinds of accusations of being child haters and mother haters and all the rest of it. because you say that women have a right to actually actively not want to be mothers. And I wanted to show myself that this is not the case. That most of the women that go through the kind of abuse that I campaign to stop, most of the women are mothers. And many of the tactics used by violent and abusive men are against women and using children as a weapon. And what I found in talking to many of these parents of children that had been caught by their gender cult was that actually one parent, would affirm and the other would not affirm, and that would be a site of conflict between the parents, and often on purpose, often again using the child as a bartering tool. So altogether, I just found it fascinating, but horrific as well.
So talk about some of these characters. They're not characters, they're real people, but the case studies. I was particularly struck by the parents where the father was just absolutely torn up about the degree to which he had affirmed in the beginning. And I think this is something that you see because ordinary people don't walk around obsessing about this issue and reading every blog and listening to every podcast. And so the daughter says, I'm trans, and he gets on board with it and then ends up like doing a very abrupt 180. But talk about him a little bit.
Well, he is a working class man, very bright, working class, non-privileged, you might say, man, because I know your class system is extremely different from ours. So he is not the usual demographic, the David Tennant and the kind of Hollywood types that embrace this. But having said that, he didn't know very much about it. And this is, of course, what the gender cult rely on when there's grooming involved, which there often is. And he just believed his daughter, that he thought that it would be an answer to her myriad of problems. She was on the autistic spectrum, as almost all of the children of, adult and young children of these parents we talked to are. And of course, most of them are same-sex attracted girls. And he just wanted to do right by her and thought that if this can solve these problems, her depression, her anxiety, then, he'd go along with it. And he felt uncomfortable all the way through, of course, because nobody actually, including the most extreme gender ideologues, believe that anyone could be trapped in the wrong body. I mean, just nobody believes it, in the way that nobody believes that trans women are women. It just isn't something that we believe.
Wait, I want to stop you here. Nobody believes it. You're saying even the gender activists, you are saying deep down they have to know this is not true.
I think not even deep down. I think they know it on the surface. They believe in gender ideology. They believe in gender identity. They think there's something floating around in their gendered brain that is gender identity that trumps even biological sex. But they don't believe it's possible to be, in essence, trapped in the wrong shell that we wear, the body.
Okay.
And so, but he wanted to do right by his daughter, and she was asking for full body suits. So not just the breast binders and not just the prosthetic penis, but, actual defined muscles and six pack. And he stopped at that.
It was an incredible detail. I didn't know such things existed. Mm-hmm. So she actually, and presumably people are purchasing these online. Yeah. Like we know about the binders. And I think in this case, she was wearing like two at the same time.
Three sometimes.
And okay, so this is like a sort of muscle suit you can buy?
It's a muscle suit. It's as if you were going to a fancy dress ball and you wanted to go as Arnold Schwarzenegger in his bodybuilding days. I mean, I learn something new every time I delve into this from a different angle.
Okay. And all right. And so she was talking about this. And how old was she when she started to express this? Do you remember?
Yeah, she was 15. And then she ended up in hospital because she'd been, by this stage, on testosterone for, I think, about 6 months. And, she was a young same-sex attracted female. That's what she was. But she had convinced herself that she wanted to be a boy. Now, that language is important. Not that she was a boy, but that she wanted to be a boy. In the way that I, growing up in the 60s and 70s, wanted to be a boy, because I had 2 brothers who were given more freedom. They weren't sexually harassed or bullied at school. They didn't have periods, which made you feel yucky. And they weren't lesbians. So, for all of those reasons, I wanted to be a boy. Same as this young woman. She ended up in hospital with severe headaches because of the testosterone. And a doctor, a good doctor, a doctor that actually should represent all doctors, but is actually quite exceptional, said to her, "Were you bullied at school?" And she said, "Yes, I was." I mean, she was very severely bullied for being a lesbian and also for being a little bit different because she was autistic. And he said, "And is this why you want to change sex? Is this why you say you're trans?" And she said, "Yes." And the father, of course, said at that time, at that moment, he thought, "What have I done? What have I done?" And obviously, he just tried to do the right thing. And if you've got this propaganda coming at you from every angle and all the institutions buy into it, the institutions that you used to respect, then you can't blame this man. Anyway, she did a bit of a kind of road to Damascus about turn, and she's now 18. She's living happily as a lesbian and has a nice girlfriend. So that's a lovely, happy ending.
And just because listeners are probably wondering, where was her mother in this equation? The parents were divorced or separated, right?
Yeah, but they were very close and very committed to jointly raising their children. And the father, after the doctor asked this question and something just shifted, he went and did a deep dive into the critique of gender ideology, the origins, I suppose, of the new gender movement, the medicine, the capture of the institutions, how it had happened. And it is very shocking, isn't it? Because I think a lot of liberals in particular have gone through this past 20 years just thinking it's something like the lesbian and gay liberation movement, or it's just another form of treatment for people who are a bit like being neurodiverse, which of course is the new lingo that drives me mad. So, I think that the mother, as soon as the father started saying, "Have you seen this? Have you read this? Have you heard this podcast, this program outlining the dangers and the risks?" And of course, she was fully on board. But they were careful with their child because, of course, the worst thing that you can do, I am told, as I've said, I'm not a parent, is to then kind of go extreme, about turn and start saying, "This is dangerous. You can't do this." They took it at her pace. And as I say, she's through this and they're delighted. She's doing really well.
There's another example of a family where social services got involved. And I know that's something that you've talked about a lot. And I've talked about it a little, and I want to cover it more because I think this is so important and very strange, the way that social workers and teachers are sort of disproportionately bought into this. And I want to talk about why you think that is. But first, tell us the story of this particular family.
I mean, this is beyond belief for most people. And the child involved, her biological mother died, and further down the line, when she was quite a young child, and then a bit further down the line, her biological father married again. So stepmother, father, very, very loving, happy family, another sibling. And all of a sudden, same story, social contagion, same-sex attraction, autistic spectrum, and during lockdown, starts to say, "I'm a boy." I mean, honestly, lockdown did so much harm for when it comes to this issue with kids just being left to stare into screens and not have human interaction. And I'm not a COVID skeptic, and I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I was rushing to those vaccinations as soon as they were available. But even so, we can't deny the harm that the lockdowns did. And I hear it constantly from parents and from young people themselves. Anyway, so she wanted to be a boy. Very long story short, there are all kinds of problems and all kinds of trauma in this girl's life, playing out, this trauma in really unhealthy ways. So social workers and the mental health services for children run by our National Health Service should have been able to see, as they should with all of these kids, that there are various problems to sort out here stemming from X, Y, and Z. All they see now is, gender dysphoria. She's in this state because she really is a boy, and we need to help her transition socially in the first instance, change her pronouns, he, him at school, boy's name and the lot, without any input from the parents, just it's done. Because many of these teachers are trans activists, many social workers, I think particularly female social workers, are quite undervalued in our country, quite underpaid. There's a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. The system is broken. And heads often role of the least senior female social workers. But many of them are really captured by this ideology. And then, of course, daren't speak out and don't speak out because they'll be disliked by their colleagues or even worse. Anyway, this particular social worker came round, who sounds to me like an extreme activist, and spent some time with the girl, who was deeply unhappy because the parents wouldn't affirm, and came down from speaking with her and pointed at both parents in turn and said, you, and this is in their home, by the way, this is a boy, pointing to the child. This is a boy, and he will get what he wants, and here's my number, she said to the child. Call me if there's any problems. And they ended up losing contact with the child. She went to live with another relative, and social services and the school and the whole of the local municipality, local council where they lived, all very, very captured by trans ideology and trans activism. And they have since spent a lot of time campaigning to give information to other parents about the harms of this and about what can happen if you dare to try to protect your child from the cult. Because social workers coming into your home and then suggesting they're going to stay with other relatives, and then you never getting that child back to live with you, and who's now further down the road in terms of her transition. It's the stuff of horror stories. And this is a story that we heard over and over again. And we used that particular example because the telling of that story was so clear and so stark, but it represents dozens more that I've heard.
I'm listening to this and I completely believe it because, again, I'm so steeped in this topic and I've heard about how these things can happen. But I think for a lot of listeners, they're going to be going, okay, but there has to be more to the story. There has to be something that these parents either did wrong or got wrong. They made a wrong move. They conveyed something that caused social services to misunderstand what was going on in this family. There's always more to the story, right? Is there in any of these cases?
So what we had to do, because we're telling stories about children, about safeguarding, about child protection, and, obviously we could both, my producer and I could be in danger of libel action, of being taken to court for defamation, because we have, the terrible defamation laws in this country. Just the threat of being sued costs you an absolute fortune and puts you through hell until you can back the threat off. So for all of those reasons, we had to be particularly scrupulous in checking out the detail of the story, not because we doubted the word of the parents, but because all of us that are distressed can often tell a story where we miss important detail or where we tell the story completely from our own perspective, missing out some crucial evidence, something else that could have influenced the outcome. And we really checked these stories out. We saw documents, we read email exchanges. I mean, anything that was kind of open to scrutiny, we scrutinized it. And no, there's nothing more to that story. We're talking about loving, good parents that may have made a wrong move, made the wrong decision. I mean, such as the father who affirmed, which he thinks is a very wrong decision, but I can see how he did it. Or the parents I've just talked about now, who were treated appallingly by social services and the school and the GP. They're just really decent people. And they have been loving parents. No, there really is no other explanation for this other than that these social workers and teachers are themselves in a cult. And, I listen to loads of podcasts about cults. I'm really fascinated in cults. I know a little bit about the way that people get drawn into them. I consider some things to be cults that others might not, such as Hasidism. I have a relative who's a very, very devout Hasid, and I think that's
you mean
a cult.
Hasidic Judaism?
Yes, and I think that's a cult. We know that some Catholics, Opus Dei, are in a cult, and so my definition of cult, not everybody would agree with, but this is a cult. People swear allegiance to an anti-scientific, completely topsy-turvy logic. It's all completely the wrong way round. And yet they sign up to it because they see the punishment you get if you don't. And also for some people, they love it. They love the idea that they have a special child who, is so different and who needs all of this attention. And, it becomes quite a narcissistic ride along a kind of exciting new trend where people are just careful all the time about what they say. They're constantly asking questions about how can we help support you and your child. I mean, it's it must be quite intoxicating for some people, but yeah, I mean, there's no more to these stories than the horror that you hear through their voices.
Yeah, I think it's really good, though, the way you made a point of saying there's the Munchausen's cases on one side, and then there's like the extreme homophobes, just bigots on the other side. And most people are just in the middle because they don't know what's going on exactly. But, with the parental profile where they're sort of excited about their kid, this is a way of getting attention. I'm sure you, like I have gone on social media and Facebook and things and sort of stumbled on old friends or people who suddenly seem to have a trans kid and are being very supportive, or like, here's a GoFundMe for my child's surgery and rah. And I'm kind of torn between thinking like, oh my gosh, this mother, it's usually the mother, not always, has gone over the top. And she's obviously getting something out of this. And this is about her. And thinking, well, she's terrified of losing this child. They're being held hostage by the child's threat of going no contact. So this is like, they're just grasping at straws by going, hey, contribute to this crowdfunding for my child's mastectomy. And it's like a mess.
I completely agree with you. And I think that's a really important piece that we mustn't forget. I just want to say one thing. You're right that, these two extremes with the Munchausens on the one hand and then the kind of homophobic bigots on the other. Unfortunately, actual, real homophobic bigots, which are quite rare in Western society under democracy, they're more likely to be pro-trans.
Yes.
Because they think that it normalizes you. And that's something that people refuse to accept. In 2007, I did a radio program, a BBC radio program, where I was debating with four pro-trans ideology people, two of whom were transgender, called Hecklers. I think it's still around somewhere, where I put forward the point that the highest number of sex change surgeries, as we used to be able to call them, instead of gender affirmation, were performed in Iran.
Yeah.
Not known for its pro-gay or pro-women legal system
or for its medical
socio-
tourism.
Right, exactly. But anyway, but to come back to what you said about parents being held hostage, absolutely right. And in particular, I think the kind of upper middle class liberal parents who have had more of an opportunity to explore ideas and sit around at the awful dinner party talking about ideas and being open to all kinds of difference that might face them. And I think that they, and of course, there's nothing wrong with being one of those people, but I think that they are the ones that are lured into this out of the goodness of their heart, and understandably, that they just think, well, my child is in pain and this is the way to do that. And, there's an element there of the reason why I raise social class and relative wealth in this scenario is that the community that I'm from, which is a working class community in the northeast of the country where nobody goes to university, that it's more likely that you will say to a child, for God's sake, stop whinging. We have to go and find your father in the bar because we haven't got enough money for dinner until he comes home. Now, that's a terrible stereotype, but it's also true that people from those communities are far more down to earth with their children and saying, look, we need to get this sorted out. Of course, you're not going to go and have your body messed up by surgeons and go on drugs. I mean, it's way less likely. So it is class-based, this issue.
That's so interesting because, and again, this is anecdotal, but I have noticed, in certain urban areas, like where I live sometimes in New York, I live in a very Dominican neighborhood, and I see a lot of young kids of color, Black Dominican kids, Black kids, Puerto Rican kids, that are gay men, gay boys, but they look like they're transing a little bit. Like I see sort of evidence of, physical changes, and there's just like maybe a little touch of it. It's not just a cross-dressing thing. They're doing something more. And I feel like this is, especially in big cities, this is so accessible that they're able to just go to some kind of clinic or Planned Parenthood in some cases and get this stuff. And maybe a lack of parental supervision is allowing this to happen. I don't know if you've observed this like in larger cities, maybe.
Well, I haven't particularly, but definitely what used to be. I mean, look, there's never been a gay community, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous phrase.
Well, there's no community.
There is no community.
I'm part of the blonde community myself.
Right.
Yes.
Anyway, the kind of scene, the social commercial scene, which used to be lesbian and gay primarily. So whether we're talking about bars or clubs or cafes or whatever, used to be very specific. It used to be the lesbians would go along and play pool, gay men would go along and drink, vodka and diet soda because they were all watching their weight. And, we would have a joke and a laugh and dance to the music that we all dance to, and then go home and not think about each other for the rest of the week. And now, of course, it's supposed to be an LGBTQI2 spirit plus community, which invites absolutely everybody into it, apart from John down the road who walks his poodle on a Sunday and occasionally washes his car. Everybody's in it. And so I think that for gay men, and I've seen this a little bit in London, that they are asserting their campness a little more. And I don't think any of it's innate. I think it's behavior that we adopt when we become tribal. And I think that for some gay men, they have been hugely influenced by this fad and craze. And I think for some other gay men, they are reverting to the old butch look of the 1980s 70s and 80s in clubs where they would wear handkerchiefs in the back of their jeans and check shirts, and that was the uniform, big heavy workman's boots. So I think that when you say, that stupid theory that should never have gone anywhere, this Judith Butler gender is performance, if you get people believing that idiocy, as opposed to that gender is, as far as I'm concerned as a feminist, an imposition and useful to keep women down, then you will have people just thinking that they are innately feminine, and you see gay men now talking about their innate femininity, which is rubbish. I don't have innate femininity, and I am an actual female. It's so I don't know if that's related to it, but also what's happening in the UK in terms of class is that, yes, of course, it's a very top-down movement. This is driven by upper middle class, the upper middle class elite, but lots of working class, very abused, actually below working class. I'm talking about what you might refer to as trailer trash communities, which I know it's a terribly unkind slur, and I'm using it because it's to describe the people who aren't working class because they've never had an income. Right. And they are on the margins of society, living in temporary accommodation, lots of anger, violence, drug and alcohol misuse, and no support from external forces because they're seen as scum. And many of the girls in this particular one town, northern town called Blackpool, which was very affected by the child abusing grooming gangs, as well as many others, that many of these girls have been horribly sexually abused. They're self-harming, they're traumatized, and, they might end up in hospital. They all have social workers. And so therefore, they've all been directed as a one-stop shop to the gender clinic because this is a cure-all. So there's this cohort of girls raised with neglect and poverty and abuse who are having all of their problems solved, except for they're not, by being told you're really a boy. And for that moment in time, it makes sense to them. They escape the body that's caused them so much pain, and they think that they'll get attention because they're desperate for attention, because they've been neglected, because their parents don't parent. And there you have an abused underclass of girls that have been put through this factory as well.
I want to talk about your reporting on the grooming gangs, because I know you were the one who broke that story back in 2006 or 2007 or so, if not earlier. But before we get to that, I want to kind of come to that a little bit later. Since you mentioned social workers, something I keep asking myself: who becomes a social worker or a teacher now? Is this just a new generation, and they over-index for being vulnerable to this kind of ideology? It's obviously these are not the old school marms who taught us. This is a new kind of profile who goes into this profession, who goes to ed schools, who goes to social work school. How would you characterize them?
That's a really important question. I've just spent a few days with a friend of mine who heads up, she's a very senior social worker in her 60s and heads up a child protection unit in one of the London boroughs. And, her team is fantastic. I've actually been up to talk to her team about issues relating to violence against women. And of course, the best way to protect a child is to protect that child's mother from when we're talking about male violence. And I was asking her, why would anyone become a social worker today? And we had that conversation. And you're right, that there was a cohort of teachers and social workers, largely female, that got into these professions because they considered themselves caring. And of course, mainly you're dealing with children and of course their parents, and that they probably wanted to do something really good in the world. That thing about, if you had a good teacher, it just takes one good teacher, and that can really inspire kids, especially in the school I was in. I was at a sink school, as we call it, a really, really bad failing school Unfortunately, I didn't have that one good teacher, but there you go. And now I think that the recruitment for children, for teachers and social workers is on its knees. And at the same time, we've got people coming in from other countries to be trained as teachers, and people are kicking off about migration and taking our jobs. So it's an impossible situation.
Okay, but do they tend to just be more progressive anyway? Why do they get into this?
I doubt if any of the, what I would call the blue fringed mob, those that cancel everyone for using, inappropriate language, and would doubtless, call you and I Karens because they've heard the word and think it's clever. I don't think that they would go into that profession. I think that they're bullying their way through other professions like publishing and the media. So I don't know who is being recruited and trained up as social workers, because in my country, we've had various scandals of dead children that should not be dead, that should have been saved.
Yes.
And female social workers, usually of junior rank, are the ones who are blamed. With teachers, I think morale has never been lower, and yet at the same time, there's quite a few trans activists who are teachers in schools.
Right.
So they're coming out of university, and then many of them are male, but many of them are female, and going into the teaching profession and are effectively teaching kids ideology rather than what they should be teaching, or opening up their brains to learn. They're closing brains down by imposing views upon them. And even the teaching style that you see, it's shocking. And I've heard this again from loads of parents and some young people. They're being told what to think. They're being told what is correct. They're not even being told what to think. They're being told not to think, just to repeat mantras.
Well, in the States, this is apparently what's being taught in ed schools. I mean, this is kind of the default. So if you, like I said earlier, if you go to social work school, or if you go to, teachers college, most of them are like this. But again, I keep trying to figure out why this is. I mean, this is a controversial theory. You probably won't like this, but Sarah and I have talked about on the other podcast, the women's movement allowed very ambitious, very smart women to go into professions other than teaching and social work. So you had like the really smart women, not to put too fine a point on it, suddenly doing other things. And so now what we have are people becoming teachers. I'm not going to say that they're less intelligent, but there might be just a different kind of intellectual profile.
I think many of these women, for example, who end up being idiots and flying the trans flag, and not just the trans flag. I mean, there's the holy trio, isn't there? There's sex work is work, trans women are women, surrogacy is a human right. I mean, they all sign up to that. And of course, we've now got a fourth plinth here. We've got River to the Sea. They know nothing at all about the Middle East, but they instantly go full default position. Israel has no right to exist. The Palestinians are eternal victims, and we're going to march through the streets shouting, as happened last week in London, to a group of Jews, go home and count your money. So, we've got them all on those topics, all agreeing with each other, always. Right. And so I think some of these women would be very smart, but for my perspective on this isn't the women's movement. You have a very different women's movement in the States anyway. Yours is very lean in, liberal kind of focus. And ours was always much more grassroots, but we can argue about that anytime you like. But I think what's happened for me is universities. Universities have become businesses. They now, of course, exist to profit from not just wealthy overseas students, but wealthy, UK or British-born students who demand that they will get what they want. They will not be told by their lecturers what to do. They will do their own thing. If a book on rape distresses them, they will have a trigger warning put on this. They will not be taught about the origins of slavery because this is offensive to people of colour, blah, blah. So I think it's universities that have cosseted these spoilt brats that were also spoilt at home. And then they go out into the workforce. And what can we expect?
If you heard yourself saying this 20 years ago, would you be shocked? If let's say your 30-year-old self heard what you just laid out, what would your 30-year-old self have made of that?
I would have disagreed with myself. Partly because universities weren't like that then. And I went to university as a mature student. So I had no schooling. I met my partner who had been to a very elite university and said, why are you so anti-university? Get yourself, go and get some qualifications and then go to university. And it was so different. You were really enabled to think critically, and I was able to organize my thoughts in a way that meant I could write them down rather than knowing what I thought but couldn't articulate it. It was perfect. So I wouldn't have agreed with that, but I think if I have really changed my view on so many things in the last, I think 20 years in particular, because I know certainly I was always part of a tribe. I was always part of a left-wing feminist tribe. I never trotted out mantras. I always had very lively arguments and debates and disagreements within feminist events and with my feminist friends. And, I was never one of those kind of sheep that wanted to follow everyone else. But I was part of a tribe and it was straightforward. And for me, feminism is still straightforward. It's an absolute necessity, and proper feminism, as opposed to some of the utter bullshit that passes for it these days, has both made great strides and still has a long way to go. But now I am tribeless. I have no tribe, right? I have a massive number of friends and colleagues and very close relationships. So I never feel lonely. I feel like I'm just floating without knowing anymore, in a way, who I want to vote for, which political party I want to vote for. And I can't vote for any of the others other than Labour because they're all so much worse even. And, I can't agree with the way that some of the actual feminists, when I say feminists, I really don't mean the faux feminists. I mean the actual feminists doing the actual work. I disagree with so many of them on so many things now. And I think it's become very lazy and unthinking. And the movement just drags its feet. The women that I feel that I'm allied to and who are, if you like, my tribe, are those that get things done, that do very effective campaigning for change and effect that change and make an actual material difference to women and girls' lives. But otherwise, I'm not one of them. I don't feel that I'm one of them anymore.
When you say faux feminists doing and saying things you don't agree with, can you give an example or two?
Well, there's the likes of Clementine Ford. Is it Clementine Ford, the Australian columnist, and Laurie Penny, who was a columnist in the UK, who are just very self-serving, self-publicist, support anything bad that happens to women. They call it empowerment. Lap dancing is empowering, sex work is empowering, surrogacy is a human right. They sell women down the river. Trans women are women, don't you know? Well, you can't possibly say it's all right to put a male sex offender or a man of any kind in a women's prison or changing room and call yourself a feminist. You just can't, right? You absolutely cannot. So if they're saying trans women should be allowed in the spaces that I and others built and the younger generations of women support and volunteer at and use and need, if they're saying take them away and let men run the rape crisis centre, as happened in Scotland recently, let men who are rapists into women's prisons that we campaigned for because of sexual violence from male guards. If that's happening, and that there are women that are behind this, and there are many, many, many women that push trans ideology, then they're not feminists. And if they're supporting sex work or prostitution, as I describe it, the right for men to have one-sided sexual pleasure with no consent from the woman, because the cash is the consent, if they're supporting a class of women to be used as a masturbatory aid for a man who doesn't want a two-way sexual encounter, fuck them. They're not feminists. And if they think that you can rent the womb of a desperate woman to provide a baby to a couple, and that if they're a gay male couple, they have a right to a child, no, you don't get to call yourself a feminist.
Well, they're going to say they're capitalists. She's making money. What's wrong with that? That's going to be their argument.
They also call themselves leftists. So actually, if you look at something like surrogacy, it's the interface between the most extreme form of patriarchy and capitalism out of control. Because when you start using the inside of a woman's body as a workplace and celebrate it as empowerment, and incidentally, have you ever heard men talk about empowerment as something good that they do? Never. I'm going to go a round of golf. It's empowering. But once they start talking about that, then they've lost the plot. And if you support a system like the global sex trade or the global surrogacy trade, they wouldn't support the global tobacco trade. They call themselves anti-racist. And this is what makes me laugh. Excuse me. This is what makes me laugh particularly, Riley. They say they're anti-racist, and yet they celebrate a system of prostitution which affects women. The most brutal treatment of women in the sex trade is reserved for women of colour, for Indigenous women, for Black American women, for British Asian women. White women are also abused in the sex trade in their droves. But there's a sexualised racist violence that women of colour in the sex trade who've escaped talk about that actually makes my blood run cold. And these women are used and spat out, seen as scum, seen as subhuman. Look at the missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada. And yet they're supposed to be anti-racist activists, but they're celebrating the male sex right, some kind of paid rape that affects women who are the most desperate. So how can they call themselves socialists? And how can they call themselves anti-racist? It's hypocrisy beyond belief.
So what do they say? Have you ever confronted any of them about this or talked about it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
How do they defend themselves?
Well, if you take the right of women of colour to feed her children by earning money through sex work, then you're just a white feminist. So my friend Rachel Moran, who is a sex trade survivor and author of a brilliant book on this, she put it really succinctly when the head of a human rights organisation said, well, there are problems with sex work, but why deny the right of Black women? I think he might have been talking about women in India at the time, to make money to feed their kids. And she said the thing to do when a woman is hungry or a child is hungry is to put food in their mouths and not your cock, not your dick. And I think that's very fair. And so I say to them that you would not expect women who are in the upper echelons of society to go out and sell sex out of desperation. You just accept that there's a subclass of women who have to do this, and that men will gravitate towards them because they're desperate and vulnerable. And so, no, it would be the same as saying if a child is orphaned, that they should go up a chimney and sweep it. We outlawed that in the UK, rather a long time ago, because we saw that it was exploitation and harmful.
Regarding surrogacy, Do you think that gay male couples or infertile couples just are out of luck? What should they do? Do they not deserve to have a baby?
Absolutely not. Nobody deserves to have a baby. The baby is being produced in order to be raised, taken away from its mother, its birth mother, and raised by people that have purchased a baby. Because even if you talk about altruistic surrogacy, they're so rare as to be the kind of very similar to the happy hooker. You know, they're so rare, but they're wheeled out as examples. These altruistic surrogates who love being pregnant. There's no harm to her health. The baby will have a relationship with the surrogate mother, will be told all about how it came into the world, raised by loving parents. No, you've actually created a baby. It's very different from saying, look, there are these babies in foster care or children's homes that need a loving family. These babies already exist, right? These infants, these young people already exist.
Yes. However, the adoption conversation, I think, is starting to evolve more, and actually fascinates me because I think people romanticize adoption as well. And the foster care thing, I know a little bit about that because I've been a volunteer in the court system here as a court appointed special advocate. And, you know, I was also sort of naive about, oh, it must be so great. You could adopt an older child. And, you know, even if you're a terrible parent, it's better than what they would have had. So
no, I agree with you.
It's so complicated. And I don't know. The surrogacy thing, it's tricky. I have friends who've done it and who are great parents, and they say, well, we paid our surrogate $100,000 and she's going to do it again. And she's delighted and everybody's happy. And I feel it's not my place to argue with that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I know I was talking to a grown, a woman who's now adult, has children of her own, who was born through surrogacy. And she said, you know, people aren't looking at the effects on us. We were sold. Our mothers sold us. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's pretty grim. You live in a neighborhood, your neighbors all see a heavily pregnant woman, and the next thing, there's no baby, and they assume that the child has died in childbirth or infancy, but in fact, that child has been grown for profit. And it is, of course, there will be some parents that buy children this way because they are bought, and who will be extremely loving and be horrified at anti-surrogacy sentiment. I know they are. I've had conversations with them. But no one has the right to a child. No one has the right to their own child. Yeah, they're out of luck. They're out of luck. And I think that I agree with you 100% about the adoption thing. I would actually stop adoption. I would stop it. I think it's a disaster. I would look at a different system where you're not telling the child, whoever they're living with, that they are your parents, and putting that child through the pressure of having to pretend that this is a regular parent-child dynamic, because it isn't, and they're not that child's parent. And I think that there's ways in which we can have this discussion about how there's something in between kids being left in a group home and being raped and abused by predators that go to work there and adoption. Right? There are different ways that many people are exploring that have themselves been through adoption. And I also know, because I'm a lesbian, obviously, I know lots of women who've adopted kids, and many who've used artificial, donor insemination as well, who are appalled by the commercialization of pregnancy and the profit made now from children, but who admit that it has been a disaster. Adoption is really, really hard. And I think, again, to return to the social work topic, especially lesbian and gay parents that adopt are not given the full history of the trauma that those children have been through. And they're not particularly supported further down the line when the inevitable happens and the children go off the rails. And many, many parents, and I've heard even people that I respected that are decent human beings on the surface, return those children.
Occasionally that does happen.
Just give them back.
And okay, I'm going to go so far as to say there are rare instances, but they are instances nonetheless, when maybe that wasn't the worst thing to do. I mean, Joyce Maynard, the writer, has talked about this. Are you familiar with her? So she's the one that had the affair with J.D. Salinger when she was a very young girl, and she wrote about this. And she ended up marrying. She had a family, and then when she was divorced in middle age, she decided that she wanted to be a mom again, and she adopted 2 girls from, I can't remember what country it was. It was a international adoption, and it was just incredible. She couldn't handle it. I mean, it was not something that was going to work. And she ended up finding a better situation for them in the US, she didn't send them back overseas. Her mistake was in writing about this for a magazine for money, because, this is how we make our living as writers. But no, I agree. This is a whole other conversation. I don't want to get too far into this. It's very, very complicated. Sure. But I also want to say that, I know lots of adopted kids who are very happy, lots of adoptive parents who are happy. Like this, it's not like, I want to just be very clear. I'm not saying this never works out. Obviously, it works out quite a bit, or it wouldn't keep happening. But
I think we need to know more about the effects on children who are adopted. I mean, obviously, they would have to be adults telling this story, because it would be too risky and unethical to do that during their childhood. But I think we're hearing more now about the effects of adoption. And I visited South Korea a few years ago when I was researching the sex trade, and got really interested in this issue because so many of the women in prostitution have been through adoption and care home system and the like. Mm-hmm. And there was some really good campaigning work being done there to overhaul this notion that adoption is a replacement family. Anyway, I just got really fascinated with it. And the more I thought about it, the more I'm like you. I think it can be really romanticized, but undoubtedly also works for some people.
Yeah. I mean, and again, we're going to move on, but there was, in the U.S., I think it was called the baby scoop. So this was before Roe, in the late 60s, early 70s. That was when there were so many domestic adoptions, because abortion was not yet legal. And the year I was born, 1970, actually was the highest number of domestic adoptions. And so I happened to grow up with a lot of kids who are adopted. I mean, I've talked about this with Sarah, and this blew her mind, because she knows very few people who are adopted. I know so many in any given, grade school. Yeah. So any given grade school class, I think there were at least 2 or 3 kids who were adopted. It was like, or maybe not that many, but certainly 1 or 2.
Right.
And it was like, oh, that's just a thing about you. Whatever. Like, you're adopted. It was like, you have red hair. It was not a big deal at all. And obviously we don't know how they feel about it later. I do know several adoptees who have gone and found their biological parents, and it was a big deal, and it's really complicated. And I don't want to gloss over anything, but again, there are good outcomes,
of course,
as well. So I just want to be clear here. So, speaking of the care homes and, just the role of social workers in kids who are in really desperate situations, I want to talk about your reporting in Blackpool and with the grooming gangs. This is not a story that I was familiar with until the last couple of years. And it's more out now, but you were the first person to report on this. And so I just sort of want to ask you how you think about that reporting in the context of the gender conversation now, and was that coming up at the time back in the early aughts, or whenever you started with this?
Well, I only got interested in what was happening with child abuse gangs, no euphemistically termed grooming gangs, because of my feminism and my campaigning to end male violence against women and girls. And I only got involved in the gender war because of my feminism and my campaigning to end male violence against women and girls. So there's no other reason. This has a direct, both of these issues have a direct effect, or they shine a light on misogyny and on the complacency and often corruption of the very institutions that we are supposed to respect and that are supposed to lock up the perpetrators or deal with the perpetrators and protect the victims. And in this case, with these girls being abused, it was the police. The failure was primarily the police, but not just the police. This was also a failure of sexual health clinicians, of social services, of the neighbours, the bystanders, and school teachers as well. So to put it in context, so at around 2003-04, I started writing about the gender issue because I was absolutely appalled to hear from Canada. We refer to Canada here as Tranada on Turf Island. And it was really obvious that this self-identification that was law and policy across Canada had affected rape crisis centres and drop-in centres for prostituted girls in the downtown east side in Vancouver, because men were just able to demand to volunteer in the case of Vancouver Rape Relief, or drop into the centre that was supposed to be women and girls only. So I'd written about that. The trans activists came after me massively in 2004 when my first piece on it went online in The Guardian. They have never stopped since. So they really then changed the course of my life, because it meant that everywhere I went, including outside of the UK, there would be pickets and demonstrations, and I'd have to have police escorts and stuff. But around that time, I'd already been a feminist activist since right the way through the 80s, from when I was a teenager, and focused only on male violence. I was never interested in any of the kind of equal pay, lean-in stuff, right? I mean, it's important, it matters, but I was always in those particular trenches. So there I was, being harangued and harassed by the trans activists, and it was just a misogynistic men's rights movement, and getting really resentful that this took time and attention away from doing the work that I was really driven to do, and was at a police, they called it vice. It's a terrible word. You use it in your country as well. Vice to mean pornography, prostitution, trafficking.
Oh, yes. Things they make TV shows about.
That's right. And we don't call it vice anymore. We told the police, for a long time, and eventually they were forced to kind of change the terminology. But I was at what was called an annual police vice conference, and I was there as one of the very few civilians because of the work that I do and the reporting that I did on this issue. And there was lots of police officers talking about a missing girl called Charlene Downs. This was in 2005. She'd been missing since 2004. And they were talking about how she had gone to the amusement arcade, Blackpool, where she lived.
And explain, I don't mean to interrupt you, but for our audience, explain, this is north of England, these are northern towns. Yes. Explain the scene in places like Blackpool.
Okay, so Blackpool used to be quite a nice seaside town where working class kids, including myself, used to go for the day, where you would have rides and you would have amusement arcades, slot machines, there'd be candy floss and ice cream.
Okay,
and
so this is like Coney Island or Atlantic City or something. Okay,
its closest would be Coney Island.
Okay,
and it used to be great fun, and then of course it ran downhill, and we arrest very few sex offenders, and we convict very, very few sex offenders of those that are arrested. And so occasionally men would be sent to prison for abusing children, and then they'd come out and they'd gravitate towards places like Blackpool, because what you've got in Blackpool isn't just the amusement arcades and kids being more likely to be out at night away from their parents, and it's supposed to be a very child-friendly environment. Predators will find vulnerable kids in these areas. But the poverty was off the scale. So the drug abuse and self-harm and attempted suicide amongst children was off the scale, is off the scale. It's one of the most impoverished towns in the UK. It has single parent dwellings and temporary accommodation, very, very low standards. So there's a lot of ill health. And it's just one of those places where it has become a hellhole for kids and, for many adults that, have to negotiate their way around the benefit system and the lack of housing and the homelessness and stuff. So it's a bad place, is Blackpool. And these cops were from Blackpool and saying that they were looking for a girl called Charlene Downs. She'd been missing by then for a year and they thought she was dead. They were pretty sure she was dead. She'd gone missing from her home in Blackpool and she was last seen in an amusement arcade. And so I thought, I want to do this story because when I looked it up on Google, there was only local reporting. There'd been no national reporting at all. And they hadn't connected Charlene Downs' disappearance to endemic child abuse that we knew was going on, not only in Blackpool, but across the UK and everywhere else. So the connections are never made. When women are killed, for example, by violent male ex or current partners, connections to the domestic violence that they tried to report previously, they're never made. When we talk about, the violence against women being a form of terrorism because of the numbers involved and because of the complacency in dealing with it, we're never listened to. So what happened to Charlene was very, very much part of a pattern which goes like this. Working class, neglected girls, desperate for love and attention and bored, will go to the local takeaways, the local chicken shop, whatever, French fries, these outlets that are very cheap, that are run by men that flirt with them, that give them a cigarette, that give them alcohol. And it's soon obvious that they are bartering this for what they would call sexual favours. I certainly would call it child abuse, direct child abuse. And these girls are 13 and above. Sometimes they're even younger, but 13 is very, very significant here. Because our law on rape and consent is that the age of consent is 16, right, across the country. But that if a girl is over 13 and a man accused of raping or sexually assaulting her is in court and he can convince the jury that although she was 13, he honestly thought she was 16, he might get away with it, right? He might. It's still statutory rape, but it might be, certainly would be a less punitive sentence. If she were 11, he wouldn't get away with that. So 13 is a crucial age. And 13 is also crucial because these girls are coming into puberty. They might have already been through puberty. So they are sexualized. Often they've been sexually abused and they've been in the training camp of sexual abuse in care homes or in the family home. Charlene Downs was in the boot camp of sexual abuse at home. And her father used to bring men back from the pub for a few pounds and let adult men abuse Charlene.
And her mother was there when this was happening?
Her mother was complicit for sure, denies to this day that she knew, is fairly pathetic and a victim of his violence, but she's still complicit. I do not let her off the hook. So she was being abused, neglected, and beaten by her father. And so she was ripe for the picking by these men that ran these takeaways in a particularly rundown area, in a particularly rundown town. Now, these men were all from Jordan, from Pakistan, from Arab nations that had, legal right to remain. They weren't illegal immigrants, as some of the racist discourse goes. But these men, it's tradition. It's who runs the takeaways, right? We used to have, our national dish, fish and chips, used to be run primarily by Greek families, and now it's changed.
Takeaways means what?
Fast food outlets.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry. I forget.
No,
we
that
speak
sounds
different
good.
languages.
I like that. I'm gonna use that.
Anyway,
Okay.
so these men, so none of these men were white that ran these takeaways. And that is significant, but not in the way that some people would say it's significant. And when I started looking into it about the reports of child abuse and about families that had reported their girls going missing, having older boyfriends, coming back with condoms in their purse, having lots of phone numbers of Asian men in their phones, what they were saying was, and some of the families were racist, but most of them weren't. They were saying, look, the thing is that the Asian men that are primarily the ones doing the abusing, specifically they were Pakistani Muslim men, that might have been second or third generation, or they may have actually, been born in Pakistan and come to the UK as young men. They used to, the criminal elements within those groupings used to sell heroin, but then that became too hot to handle. There was a clampdown. And so they just decided to sell girls. And what people don't realise about the grooming gang phenomena is its profit. It's not just the men having a bit of fun by raping a 13-year-old in the back of his chicken shop, the back of his fast food outlet. It's also about him making a profit from other men. It's prostituting children. And that never gets said hardly at all. There's profit in this, and that's really important because the normalization of the sex trade allows and creates this environment. So Charlene's situation was specific to Blackpool in that the foreigners, as they're described, were from different countries, but they were all shorthanded as Pakistani. And there's quite a history of racist abuse in the UK that began in the 60s and 70s when people from Pakistan opened small shops, small stores, and kept them open really late that the white Brits didn't do. And so they were very specific to the Pakistani model of running businesses. But there was so people would go in the stores and they would buy stuff from them, but they resented them and thought of them as weird foreigners. Anyway, so we have a history of that abuse. And the grooming gangs that were obviously ignored by the police were not done so because the police were scared of being called racist when parents or even the girls themselves accused them of rape and abuse and violence. They just didn't want the hassle of having to clean up the mess of the violent riots. So when I went to the Guardian newspaper, a liberal outlet, and said, I'm finding all of this stuff, there's all of this endemic child abuse, parents were looking at it, campaign groups were looking at it. This was not new. I didn't discover it. I just wanted to do some reporting on it. And I said to the Guardian, the thing is that in some of these towns, we're hearing the same story from parents. All of these men have Pakistani names. They know from scrolling through their daughter's cell phones. These men are in gangs and groups. They're criminals. They hang out together. They all know each other. It's a very tight-knit group of a particular demographic of men. And why is it being ignored? And it was being ignored for two reasons. Well, several reasons, at least three. One, because the girls were seen as worthless and they were seen as complicit. They were seen as troublesome slags. Just that they want it. Where's the crime here? And they were from scum families. The second is because the police didn't want the hassle of the race riots.
Right.
And said that specifically. So people often mistake that for police being really upset at the idea that they would be called racist. Not at all, right? They were just not wanting the hassle. But the third reason, and this is, I think I get the most angry about this, is that the good liberals, the wishy-washy cowards, all said this is just racist conspiracy. these girls, they're just, their families are all racist. They're making it up. It's another weapon against the Pakistani community.
And they're saying this where? In newspaper editorials? How is this discourse?
They're saying it in their workplace. They're saying it in the social services. They're saying it in sexual health clinics. There were some very good people that worked in both of those professions, by the way, including one who was a whistleblower, who was a sexual health worker. But they're saying it they're saying it to me when I went to The Guardian and said, can I report on this? This is the demographic of the abusers. This is the demographic of the girls. The problem that we've got, I said to my editor, is that the far right, the actual far right, not me, who's called a far right, right? But the actual far right have capitalized on this because they're the only ones appearing to listen to the parents, right? They're the only ones saying that this is terrible, but they're doing it for the worst possible reasons, and they're using the parents. My editor said, no, we can't do this though, can we? We'll be called racist. And I remember to this day. So I took it to a not liberal paper, but a brilliant paper, the Sunday Times, and published it in the magazine there. And obviously, I wasn't coming at this from a racist standpoint, so it wasn't a racist piece. But really, this was happening in towns and cities all around the UK, perpetrated by white men also, and perpetrated against some Asian girls also. But the majority of this particular group of men that were criminal and that were transporting the girls around brothels in different cities and towns, were at that time in those places Pakistani Muslim. So it became known as the Muslim grooming gangs. And it's just it's just, the language is just not helpful. Not because we shouldn't say who these men were, but because it's not about a Muslim grooming gang. They weren't doing it because they were told to do it by their imam. They were doing it because they were abusive men, and they were getting away with it because race played a part in the least helpful way imaginable.
And from what I remember from some of your reporting, actual white supremacists then sort of moved in and capitalized on this dynamic.
Yeah, and some of the parents that I met when I was reporting on this were racist. They weren't, in KKK cloaks going around saying they're going to burn people's houses down. That they were using racist terminology. They were telling me I couldn't possibly get a taxi back to the station because it might be driven by a Paki, which is the racist term for anyone of Asian origin, whether or not they're from Pakistan. I was told that these men, were abusing kids because that's what they were raised to do. Now, that was racist discourse, but I do want to say something here about, I think, again, the misunderstanding of this broader issue. I don't think all things are equal. I do not think that all nations have the same level of misogyny and disdain for women, or freedom or not for women. It is extremely clear to me that there is a huge, huge disparity between women being raised in countries where Sharia law rules or where the rule of law is prevalent and where we have laws enshrined, even if they're not affected or implemented properly. You cannot possibly say that women in Pakistan are as free or liberated to the degree that we are in the West. You just can't. And I will not have it. This cultural relativism drives me mad. So it matters if you raise a boy in, for example, Gujarat, where I visited a few years back, where there is a village entirely set up for prostitution. The girls are all raised to be prostituted. The boys are all raised to be pimps or assistant pimps.
Where is this?
Right?
What
in Gujarat, in India.
Oh, okay.
And, it is absolutely ridiculous to think that if you raise boys in countries where women have no legal, social, rights or freedom, that these attitudes will not prevail for the rest of his life, unless he's quite exceptional and his mother and father are quite, left of field. It matters in the context in which we are raised.
Yes, my Pakistani podcast partner would concur. I can tell you that she talks about this a lot. So some of my listeners will.
And in the same way that I was raised. Yeah, I was raised in a working class culture where barely, like I say, there was very poor levels of education, quite old-fashioned ideas because it's the northeast of the country, and that. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the US, but it's certainly not New York, let me tell you that. And, the sexism there, when I go home, and I've got a very loving, close family, but when I go home, I notice the sexism is off the scale compared to what you would, in a metropolitan city. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I really would encourage people to go back and read your reporting on this, as well as the reporting that's been done, because it's a fascinating story that people really don't know very much about. We have to wrap up. There's so much more to talk about. And I want people to listen to your podcast for all kinds of reasons, but especially because in addition to these family stories that we've been talking about, you talk with experts and clinicians. Those are really fascinating interviews. Hannah Barnes, David Bell, is it Dr. Oz? Is it Dr. Oz Hakeem?
Yeah,
that was incredible.
The transgender trend
yes.
Women. There's some amazing people doing brilliant work on this that aren't directly impacted. Well, we're all directly impacted, but not like the kids and their parents. But yeah, there's some great people that we talk to.
It's really incredible. Well, my last question, I wonder what you make of this, because this is something I wrestle with. I know personally, more than one, a handful of families that went through this maybe almost 10 years ago now, probably starting 2014, 2015, transition their child. Same thing. They didn't know what was going on. They did the right thing. They went to the best children's hospitals. They went to the best gender clinics. They got all the information that was available at the time. They did a social transition and a medical transition. And as far as I can see, the kids are thriving. I don't know personally. In some cases, I'm sure they would never talk to me, knowing how I talk about this issue. But from what I can see, and in some instances, mutual friends tell me the kids are doing great. So how do you square that? There are going to be cases where even if the kid would also have done fine or great if they had just ridden it out and eventually desisted and probably gay, they're also doing great this way. So how do you think about that?
I'm very skeptical. That's all I can say. And lifelong medical intervention that was not necessary tends not to have great outcomes. And look, this is an analogy that will send some of your subscribers absolutely wild with fury, and I apologize in advance to you. I don't mind making people angry if it's something I genuinely believe and want to say. The analogy I'm going to use is the way that many, many, many women, every single one of them just about, that I interviewed who were in the sex trade, in legal brothels in Nevada, in illegal brothels in the US, and everywhere in between, that I interviewed, who told me it was great. They loved their work. They loved their clients. There was no adverse effect. They hadn't been raped. Nothing bad had happened to them. It was a great way to make money. Every single one of the women that I have spent time with and interviewed and traveled with and worked with who have got out of the sex trade tell me the direct opposite.
But that's because they're talking to you. You're getting that particular sample.
I think not necessarily, because I have been in situations with women where I've heard their story well before I get to talk to them. And you're right, of course, we all get a particular sample, but I'm very skeptical is all I'll say. But I'll say something else as well, which is that there are exceptions. There always are. There are people who have smoked four packs of cigarettes a day all their lives and never get lung cancer. There are exceptions to everything, but we should never make law or policy based on a small minority of exceptional people. We should look at the vast majority, and we certainly need a hell of a lot more information and evidence about the harmful drugs that they've made somebody a lot of money. And I'm not a big pharma conspiracy theorist, but they have made someone a huge amount of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree that it's probably a significant minority that seems to be thriving. And I actually, I like you, and I know we have to wrap up. I have changed my thinking. I used to think that there was maybe a very, 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 very small percentage of kids who were genuinely trans, and this could potentially be the right protocol. But I'm increasingly skeptical about that. But I do think, I mean, it's obvious. We know that there are going to be a lot of people who've transitioned, who have made irreversible changes.
Yeah.
They have parents who have supported that, and they are going to be walking around in the world for the rest of their lives in the condition that they're in.
Right.
And they are going to have to we're going to have to make a space for them. And, and also for their parents, because I think one thing I really liked about your series is that it emphasized the degree to which the parents are victims, often just as much as anybody else. Like sometimes I get very angry at these parents for going along with it, or just not questioning it enough. But I think Hannah Barnes makes this point. I think it's her. She says, up until or maybe it wasn't her, maybe it was the woman from Transgender Trend, up until maybe 2017, 2018, 2019, nobody could really be blamed for going along with this, because we just didn't know.
Right. And we've got to make space for those adults and the parents, and there's a long and difficult road ahead.
Yeah. Well, Julie, thank you for doing this series and for all of your work over the years, and for coming on the podcast. It's absolute delight to talk with you, and I hope you'll come back.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope so too.
That was my conversation with the legendary Julie Bindel. She is a journalist, broadcaster, author, and feminist activist against male violence toward women and girls. Her latest book, Lesbians, Where Are We Now?, will be published next year. You can also find her on Substack, which I'll link to in the show notes. And of course, her new podcast, Julie in Genderland, is now out. You can binge it. You can listen to all 10 episodes at once. I highly recommend. Once again, ladies, if you want to continue this conversation in the Unspeakeasy, my community for free-thinking women, Julie will be zooming in as an unspeaker on Tuesday, November 19th. So do not delay. Become a member now. Go to theunspeakeasy.com. Find out what we're all about. We have incredible unspeakers this fall. In the meantime, I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for joining me. See you then.